Okay, sorry, I'm trying to keep up with who's coming in and it's not. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, so today we have Dr. Michael Haynes. So he has been an active Rotarian for about 25 years in 3 different locations. And he has experience in leadership and higher education, nonprofit organizations as a professor, researcher, and administrator. And he's the founding president and CEO of the Whitaker Center Productions. So with that, I will turn it over to him.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really delighted to share my behind-the-scenes perspective on the making of Expedition Chesapeake, A Journey of Discovery, a 42-minute giant screen documentary film for IMAX theaters. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States has predicted, of the United Nations, has predicted that by 2025, that's less than 4 years from today, 1.8 billion people will be living in regions of the world with absolute water scarcity. As much as 2/3 of the world's population, located on every continent, is expected to face water shortages. Fresh water makes up only a very small fraction of all water on the planet. While nearly 70% of the world's surface is covered with water, only 3% of it is fresh water. And 2/3 of that is trapped in glaciers, otherwise unavailable for human use. Less than 1% of the planet's fresh water is available to nourish its 7.7 billion people. Many of the water systems that keep our ecosystems thriving and feed a growing human population have become stressed. Rivers, lakes, and aquifers are drying up, or becoming too polluted to use. Less than 1% of the planet's water is available to nourish its 7.7 billion people. Many of the water systems that keep our ecosystems thriving and feed a growing human population have become stressed. Rivers, lakes, and aquifers are drying up and becoming too polluted to use. More than half of the world's wetlands have disappeared. We believe that a film about estuaries, watersheds, and water resources, Expedition Chesapeake that is a timely and important film. For 30 years before the film was developed, a team of educators, scientists, and environmental advocates researched, created, and field tested educational materials on water issues. These materials were created to support the film and provide for expanded learning experiences. They include over 400 pages of detailed lesson plans for elementary students and a semester-long course of study for middle school and secondary school students. All of these materials are available to parents and teachers at no cost at the Expedition Chesapeake website. From the very beginning, we envisioned a film about water issues that would capture the imagination and curiosity of students and ignite their interest in science. At the very least, it is my hope that this film will inspire successive cohorts of those students to become enlightened stewards of this critical natural resource. Estuaries are the most productive ecosystems on Earth. In addition to the 500 million pounds of seafood harvested each year from the Chesapeake Bay, the Bay is also an economic engine for the region, with an impact of more than $30 billion each year. In our journey to create this film, we discovered that estuaries around the world are facing similar challenges to the Chesapeake Bay. Because the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in North America and the 3rd largest estuary in the world, we hope that audiences everywhere will find this film interesting, relevant, and informative. With these points in mind, we searched for a credible scientist who could tell this story, lead us on a journey to understanding, and also connect with students, parents, and teachers. Thus, we convinced 3-time Emmy Award-winning Jeff Corwin to be a part of the project. We also wanted to create a giant screen film that displayed the stunning natural beauty of this watershed, which covers 64,000 square miles and portions of 6 states, as well as the captivating landscapes of the 4,800 square miles of the bay, along with the 11,000 miles of shoreline. As you might imagine, producing a film for giant screen theaters is challenging, since the projection screen is more than 40 feet tall and at least 70 feet wide. For comparison, it would take about 250 big screen televisions that you might have at home to fill the typical giant screen. Our award-winning production team was fortunate to recruit one of the most acclaimed giant screen cinematographers, James Nyhouse, to bring the extraordinary images of the watershed in the bay to the screen. We decided to tell the story of the relationships between people, the watershed, and the bay by featuring iconic animals that make their homes in the unique habitats found here. We were fortunate to identify a group of esteemed and dedicated scientists to help us tell those stories. In most cases, these scientists have devoted 25 to 40 years of their lives to this research. Finally, we wanted the film to deliver an optimistic message. We believe that there is hope in our future. We know that when humans are willing to address environmental challenges, ecosystems do recover. Plants and animals thrive. We began planning the production of the film in 2010 and started working to raise the $2.8 million that was required to produce the film. 7 years later, in October of 2017, the board of directors of Whitaker Center Productions, the nonprofit corporation we created to produce the film, made the decision that we had sufficient funds to move forward with film production. We signed a contract with a production company in late November 2017, and filming began in March of 2018 and was completed in October of 2018. Post-production began in November, and the film premiered at Whitaker Center for Science and the Arts in Harrisburg in March 2019, just 1 year after we started filming, and premiered internationally in Vancouver, British Columbia in September 2019. The production involved 60 days of shooting, and nearly all of the filming was outdoors. The film crew traveled over 12,000 miles throughout the watershed. We were grateful to have the help of more than 135 dedicated professionals who worked on the film. I'd like to share with you some of the photographs that we captured during the production. It's important to point out that most of the photos that I will share with you were taken with a rather ordinary camera, not the ultra high definition 8K digital cameras we used to shoot the film. Again, our goal was to communicate the importance of a healthy watershed as essential for a healthy estuary. As I mentioned, we are telling the story through iconic species and a selected group of scientists who have devoted their careers to understanding, nurturing, and sustaining these species. Next slide, please. We began our journey in the wilderness watershed, just a few miles from Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, on Pine Creek, with a fascinating story of recovery of river otters. Next slide, please. This is an example of the rugged natural beauty in this massive watershed that we featured in the film. Next slide, please. Jeff Corwin accompanies Dr. Tom Surface on a search for river otters. Dr. Surface began introducing river otters in this region when the habitat began to recover in the early 1980s. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we were fortunate to recruit the leading cinematographer in giant screen films, James Nyhouse. That's James kneeling on a rock in the river and filming Jeff and Dr. Surface as they pass by on their raft. Next slide, please. From the northern portion of the watershed in Pennsylvania, we moved to the southern end of the Chesapeake Bay to film blue crab living in the shallow waters around the Goodwin Islands. Next slide, please. Our days typically began around 6 o'clock in the morning and involved loading the camera boat with all of the equipment that we would need for a day of filming on the water. Next slide, please. Dr. Ron Lipschitz and Dr. Rochelle Seitz are the featured scientists in the segments focusing on oysters and blue crab. They are both research faculty at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Next slide, please. Our production team did a fantastic job capturing fascinating footage of scientists engaged in their research on the water. And as you can imagine, getting a steady frame with both boats on the water was a real challenge for our camera crew. Next slide, please. The next stop on our journey was the James River in Virginia, where we visited with Dr. Brian Watts, the director of the Center for Conservation Biology. Dr. Watts is internationally known for his work with endangered bird species. In this photo, he is climbing a navigation marker to retrieve a young osprey from the nest. Next slide, please. The crane with one of our 8K cameras mounted at the end of a 24-foot boom was essential to get close-up shots of the nest and Dr. Watts' interaction with the birds. Next, please. Dr. Watts is holding and calming the young osprey before he lowers it to the boat where he will install an identification band. The osprey is another remarkable story of recovery that we felt was essential to include in the film. Next slide, please. Jeff Corwin and Dr. Watts are attaching a band to the bird. Wherever this bird may go, it can easily be identified as a Chesapeake Bay osprey. These Chesapeake Bay osprey typically migrate to South America for the winter months. Next slide, please. We also visited Chesapeake, Virginia, population 224, because the most pristine oyster reefs on the east coast of the United States are located northeast of this tiny village. This is one of the several shots that we took from our drones. Next slide, please. This aerial shot reflects the expanse of the oyster reefs in this state protected area. Next slide, please. This area is critical for research on the ways oyster reefs are formed in a natural environment. And the research findings are instructive in efforts to support increased reef formation in the bay. Oysters are critical to the health of the bay, since each adult oyster can filter as much as 50 gallons of water every day. Next slide, please. During the course of this project, we've encountered a number of folks who volunteered their time and resources to help with the film. For example, the owners of this 52-foot sailboat allowed us to spend a day on the bay with them to capture footage for the film. Next slide, please. This is Greg McCoskey, the film's director, shooting with one of our 8K cameras on the bow of the boat. You can see the Bay Bridge in the background. Next slide, please. And this is one of the lighthouses in the bay that we were able to capture on film during that day of sailing on the bay. Next slide, please. One of our many partners in creating the film was the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland. The center's director, Dr. Anson Hines, is being wired for sound in this photo. Dr. Hines has been conducting research on blue crabs in the bay for the last 40 years. Next slide, please. The Smithsonian provided us with a total of 4 boats, including this barge that served as our equipment boat. Next slide, please. The Smithsonian also provided this specially equipped workboat at no cost to our project. In addition, they provided us with 4 staff to assist during our time at the research center. Next slide, please. We decided that we needed to feature an iconic vessel for our epic journey, and we were pleased to find this 110-foot, 3-masted schooner known as Alliance. This shot is from the opening scene in the film, and that's Jeff Corwin standing on the bowsprit. Next slide, please. We spent over 5 hours filming the Alliance in the open waters of the bay, and we captured some amazing shots, particularly at the end of the day when this shot was taken. Next slide, please. I hope these photos give you a glimpse behind the scenes of creating this remarkable film. Fascinating animals, preeminent scientists, and breathtaking cinematography of the watershed in the bay are all hallmarks of this film. Next slide. I encourage you to visit expeditionchesapeake.org to see the trailer for the film. In addition, I encourage you to visit Whitaker Center for Science and the Arts in Harrisburg to see the film on their giant screen. Thank you for inviting me to share my experience with you. A number of sponsors and granting agencies supported the production of the film. The Dauphin County Commissioners, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources deserve special recognition for their support in the early planning phase of the project, as well as their continuing support during the production of the film. Also, the support from Pennsylvania American Water, the presenting sponsor, was critical to the project. And finally, I'm grateful to the founding members of the board of directors of Whitaker Center Productions, Mary Weber Weston, Kristen Olwine-Milkey, and Mark Caldwell, who worked with me over the 8 years that it took to actually develop, fund, and produce the film. I thank you for your interest in the importance of fresh water and a healthy Chesapeake Bay, and I look forward to responding to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute your microphone, or you can certainly use the chat box as well.
Can the film be viewed now at the Whitaker Center?
Yes, it is playing at Whitaker Center now. In fact,
do
they're reopening this next weekend.
you need a reservation?
I quite honestly, I'm not sure, but you can go to whitakercenter.org and all the information will be provided there.
I'm curious. What is the most interesting thing that you found in your research and your discovery there at the Chesapeake?
Well, quite honestly, I knew the Chesapeake Bay was important to all of us in this region. I moved to Pennsylvania about 20 years ago, and but left for a few years for another assignment and came back. And I knew the Bay was important, but I didn't realize just how critical it was, not only as a natural resource, but also as an economic resource. And the lives of so many millions of people who are tied to the Bay, so important to this region, but quite frankly, are important throughout the United States. We learned that the Chesapeake Bay is not just important to this region, but it is truly a national treasure as the largest estuary in North America that we should all care for and cherish.
Curious about the efforts on Save the Bay that have been going on for a number of years. Have those been helpful, making progress? What's the status?
The status is that the Bay has improved slightly from time to time, but there's an ongoing challenge. And the ongoing challenge that we address in the film is that there are over 17 million people who live in the watershed. And an additional 400 people move into this region every day. And they need to be fed, they need to be housed, they need to use the water that we have. And so it's so absolutely critical that we really try to conserve the natural resources that we have, and to try to improve the health of the Bay over time. When I started this project, I went up to Penn State. I think I noticed a Penn State flag there in your background. I went to Penn State to talk to researchers there and ask them, why hasn't the Bay improved? And they had one simple answer. The Bay is connected to the watershed. The watershed has to change. And the only way the watershed changes is through the changing of people's behavior. So there are over 17 million people that we have to convince that there are things that we each can do every day to improve the health of the watershed, which will improve the health of the Bay. And so that's the long-term challenge here. And that's why my hope and faith is in the future generations. And that's why the audience for this film is primarily elementary and secondary school students. And we really hope that they understand the challenge and are motivated to learn more and try to figure out ways that they can actually contribute to the future.
You may already know that our Rotary Club has had many number of tree planting events along the tributaries to the Susquehanna. in the last number of years. So we've gotten down and dirty with that.
Thank you very much. That's important. Protecting the streams, and there are over 100,000 streams and rivers in this watershed. So protecting any one of them, or as many as you can, is really very important. Thank you.
Pardon my geographic ignorance, but the Chesapeake Bay starts in New York State, correct?
That's correct.
Do you feel that you're getting equal contributions in cleaning up the bay from every state that's involved?
I think that would depend upon which state you talk to. Because
that's a loaded question. I won't get into why I know that or why I know they asked that, but anyway.
Right. It really does require everyone in the watershed doing all that they can to protect their portion of the watershed. And Pennsylvania happens to have a major portion of the watershed right here. And the major tributary, the Susquehanna River, flows directly through Pennsylvania. It does start in New York State, and that's the beginning of the watershed. So there's work to be done, I think, throughout the watershed.
And that's Cooper. Does it start near Cooperstown?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Lake Otsego.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else? We have time for one more question if anyone
Yeah,
has
I have a quick question. Dr. Haynes, you started out a lot by explaining the need for fresh water. And I guess I'm just looking for some explanation how maybe that transpires into the watershed, and how is there fresh water that's actually drank? Excuse my ignorance, but it almost seems like there's an ecosystem that's important for supplying food and stuff, but how does it tie into fresh water for us to drink? Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. No, it's a very good question. And it's the question that we continually ask ourselves as we were developing the background for the film, as well as working on putting the film together. The reality is that the bay is an interesting ecosystem because fresh water flows into it every day. And that fresh water balances off the salt water that comes in from the ocean to create this very unique ecosystem there. And so many species there would not survive in a freshwater lake, nor would they survive in the ocean. Now, there are some species that actually travel from the bay out into the ocean and then come back again to spawn. So that it's an interesting relationship between the bay and the ocean itself. But the reality is that the bay is fed every day with trillions of gallons of water from the watershed. And we felt that by emphasizing the importance of fresh water would help people understand the importance of protecting what's in their own backyard. And the idea that that fresh water is so critical, and we've taken it for granted for, I suppose, centuries, but it is so critical to the health of the watershed and the health of the bay. And so that's the link that brings the watershed in contact with the bay and creates one large sort of ecosystem here in this watershed and in the bay itself.
Wendy, can I ask another question real quick?
Yep, sure, go ahead.
I know we're pushing time. Dr. Haynes, I mean, thanks for doing this. From a pollutant standpoint, if you could call it that, what is the biggest challenge that the effort to clean the bay is facing?
Well, I would probably say there are two challenges. One is the amount of silt that flows from the watershed into the bay. That has an impact not only on the bay is over 60% of the bay is less than 6 feet deep. It's a very shallow body of water. As you add more silt, you change the habitat significantly. And that's one of the major contributors to the challenges in the bay. The other is extra nutrients. And the nutrients come from a variety of sources. But one example is the nitrogen that flows off of the fields, the agricultural areas throughout the watershed into the water supply, down the streams, into the Chesapeake Bay. And that in turn alters the habitat, particularly in the northern part of the bay, where the grasses that are there are so critical to the creating the habitat for all of the animal species that live there.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing all the great information, the great visuals. If you didn't hear it earlier, you can check out expeditionchesapeake.org and find a lot more information, not only about the film, but the watershed, resources, become an ambassador, support these great projects. So be sure to check out that website for more information as well. And go check out the film.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week, and hopefully you can join us on Friday. And if not, we'll see you back here next Monday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.